In 1347, a Venetian merchant ship arrived in port carrying more than silk and spices. Below deck sat barrels of salted herring packed 18 months earlier in the North Sea, wheels of cheese aged in alpine caves for 3 years, and clay pots of honey that had survived a journey from Constantinople without a single drop spoiled. Not one item required ice. Not one needed a cellar dug deep into permafrost. These foods traveled thousands of miles through Mediterranean heat and survived because medieval Europeans had mastered something we've almost entirely forgotten: how to preserve food using nothing but time, salt, smoke, and an understanding of microbiology they couldn't name but had observed for centuries. Today we panic when the power goes out for 6 hours. A medieval household could lose their entire building to fire and still have enough preserved food cached in various locations to survive winter. Somewhere between the invention of refrigeration and the modern supply chain, we traded resilience for convenience and lost techniques that actually worked better than what's in your kitchen right now. Salt wasn't just a preservative in medieval Europe. It was currency, political leverage, and the difference between a village that survived winter and one that didn't. When you bought salt in 1200s France, you weren't purchasing a seasoning. You were buying time itself, the ability to make August's abundance last until March's scarcity. The principle is brutally simple. Bacteria need water to survive, and salt pulls moisture out of everything it touches through osmosis. Pack a fish in salt, and within hours, the cellular water that bacteria depend on gets sucked out, creating an environment where decomposition simply can't occur. Medieval households understood this so thoroughly that they calculated salt needs by the barrel, not the pinch. A family of 6 might put aside 40 pounds of salt each autumn, an amount that seems absurd until you realize they were preserving 300 pounds of pork, 50 pounds of fish, and whatever else they could hunt, catch, or afford. But here's what modern preservation guides won't tell you. Medieval salting wasn't one technique. It was dozens, each tailored specific foods and specific results. Dry salting, where you packed meat in pure salt and let it sit for weeks, created rock-hard products that needed soaking before consumption but could last years. Wet brining, where meat sat submerged in salt-saturated water, produced softer results that stayed edible for months. Some households used a combination method: an initial dry salt cure followed by submersion in brine that balanced longevity with palatability. The British Navy salt beef, packed in barrels using medieval techniques that survived into the 1800s, remained edible for 5 years. Not technically safe to eat, actually edible. Sailors complained about its toughness and blandness, but it never poisoned them, never rotted, never required a single degree of refrigeration during voyages to the Caribbean and back. Compare that to your refrigerated deli meat, which starts growing suspicious slime after 10 days in a 40-degree environment. We think we've advanced, but we've mostly just made ourselves dependent on a power grid. Walk into a medieval longhouse in Norway during October, and you'd immediately notice something strange about the ceiling. It's black, completely black, covered in a tar-like resin that's been accumulating for decades. And hanging from the rafters, wrapped in cloth, are dozens of fish, sausages, and cuts of meat slowly absorbing the smoke from the central fire that burns day and night below. This wasn't poor ventilation. This was deliberate, sophisticated food preservation happening in the least likely place you'd expect: the family's living room. Medieval smoking worked because smoke contains hundreds of compounds that are toxic to bacteria: formaldehyde, phenols, acetic acid, while simultaneously sealing food surfaces and reducing oxygen exposure. But the real genius wasn't the chemistry. It was the architecture. By building homes where smoke had to pass through the living space before exiting through roof vents, medieval families created preservation preservation chambers that operated continuously, required no additional fuel beyond what they needed for heating and cooking, and processed food in the same space where they slept and ate. Cold smoking, done at temperatures below 90 degrees Fahrenheit, could take weeks or months. German speck, Italian speck, and dozens of regional variations emerged from this patient process, where meat slowly dried while absorbing antimicrobial compounds from hardwood smoke. The key was choosing the right wood, beech, oak, apple, each imparting different flavors and different preservative qualities. Resinous woods like pine were usually avoided for meat, but perfect for fish, where the additional phenolic compounds provided extra protection. Hot smoking at temperatures between 120 and 180 degrees cooked food while preserving it, creating products that were ready to eat but still lasted months without refrigeration. This is where medieval preservation revealed its psychological sophistication. Hot smoked products satisfied immediate hunger, while cold smoked items provided long-term security. A well-managed medieval household maintained both types, balancing present needs against future uncertainty. The smokehouses that appeared across medieval Europe's separate buildings dedicated entirely to preservation represented an evolutionary step beyond the longhouse approach. These structures allowed for controlled temperature, consistent smoke density, and the processing of much larger quantities. Medieval Europeans ate rot for breakfast. They just called it something else. Sauerkraut, pickles, cheese, yogurt, beer, wine, vinegar, soured milk, salted cabbage, fermented fish sauce. The medieval diet was dominated by foods that were, technically speaking, decomposing. But this wasn't accidental contamination. This was precision microbiology executed by people who had never heard the word bacteria but understood their behavior better than most modern home cooks. Fermentation works through competitive exclusion. When you submerge cabbage in salt water, you create an environment where beneficial lactobacillus bacteria thrive while harmful pathogens can't survive. These beneficial bacteria consume the cabbage's sugars, producing lactic acid that lowers pH to levels where botulism, E. coli, and other dangerous organisms simply die. Within 2 weeks, you have sauerkraut of food that's more nutritious than fresh cabbage, will last 6 months without refrigeration, and actively improves your digestion. Medieval households fermented everything they couldn't eat fresh. Cucumbers became pickles, milk became cheese or yogurt, cabbage became sauerkraut, grapes became wine, then wine became vinegar. Even fish got fermented. Garum, the Roman fermented fish sauce, remained popular throughout the medieval period in various regional forms, providing intense umami flavor and lasting indefinitely in sealed containers. The genius of fermentation isn't just preservation, it's transformation. Fresh milk spoils in days, becoming toxic. But if you intentionally introduce the right bacteria, that same milk becomes yogurt or cheese products that are more digestible, more nutritious, and vastly more stable. Medieval cheesemakers understood that different bacteria, different temperatures, and different aging conditions produced completely different results. A soft cheese aged 2 weeks fed a family in spring. A hard cheese aged 2 years became valuable trade goods that survived transport across Europe. But here's what separates medieval fermentation from modern attempts. They never stopped the process. Your store-bought sauerkraut has been pasteurized, killing the beneficial bacteria that made it in the first place. Medieval sauerkraut was alive, actively fermenting, changing flavor over months in ways that modern palates find strange. A barrel of sauerkraut opened in December tasted different than the same barrel opened in March. More sour, more complex, more intensely flavored. That variation wasn't a flaw, it was the point. Take cooked meat, place it in a pot, then pour hot rendered fat over it until the meat is completely submerged. Let the fat cool and solidify into an airtight airtight seal. Congratulations, you've just created confit, a preservation method that kept meat edible for months in medieval France and still works flawlessly today without a single watt of electricity. Fat sealing works because animal fat, once solidified, creates an oxygen-free environment where aerobic bacteria can't survive. Anaerobic bacteria might still be present, but the initial cooking kills most pathogens, and the fat layer prevents new contamination from entering. This isn't theoretical preservation. This is how French households stored duck, goose, and pork through entire winters, pulling individual pieces from the fat as needed and resealing the container for the next use. The method appears across medieval Europe in various forms. British potted meats, where cooked meat was pounded into paste, packed tightly into jars and sealed with clarified butter. German schmaltz, where rendered poultry fat sealed everything from chopped liver to cooked vegetables. Italian conserva, where vegetables were cooked and submerged in olive oil. Each variation adapted the same principle to local ingredients and preferences, but all shared the fundamental insight: fat creates barriers. Medieval cooks understood something that modern food safety guidelines often obscure. Preservation isn't about sterility. It's about creating environments where harmful organisms can't thrive. You don't need to kill every microbe. You just need to prevent the dangerous ones from multiplying to levels that cause illness. A sealed fat layer accomplishes this beautifully, requiring no specialized equipment, no precise temperature control, no monitoring devices, just fat, which medieval households had in abundance from cooking, and clay pots, which they already owned. The technique scales beautifully. A single duck leg sealed in fat will keep for weeks. 50 pounds of pork shoulder, cooked and sealed in lard, will feed a household all winter. And unlike salting or smoking, fat-sealed meat retains a texture and flavor remarkably close to fresh. The fat prevents oxidation, which means the meat doesn't develop the sharp, intense flavors that preserved foods are known for. This was luxury preservation expensive because it required substantial amounts of fat, but producing results that the wealthy preferred over salted or smoked alternatives. Medieval food drying required no special equipment, no dehydrator humming in your kitchen, no oven set to 170 degrees for 8 hours, just food, air, and time. Strips of meat hung in a drafty attic, apple slices laid on racks in the sun, herbs bundled and suspended from rafters, fish split open and spread on rocks. This was preservation through subtraction. Remove enough water, and food becomes shelf-stable for months or years. Water activity is the key concept modern food science uses to explain what medieval households knew through observation. Microorganisms need moisture to grow, and below certain moisture levels, they simply can't function. Bacteria typically need water activity above 0.90. Mold needs 0.80 or higher. Dry food below 0.60, and nothing grows. Medieval Europeans couldn't measure water activity, but they understood that when fruit felt leathery and meat felt hard, the food was safe. The challenge was creating conditions where moisture evaporated faster than decay occurred. This is why medieval drying happened in specific locations: attics with cross-ventilation, south-facing walls where sun exposure was consistent, smokehouses where heat and air movement accelerated moisture loss. Humidity was the enemy. A damp autumn could ruin an entire harvest of drying food, which is why wealthy households sometimes built dedicated drying rooms with adjustable vents and the capacity for small fires that provided gentle heat without cooking. Meat dried into jerky or pemmican became traveling food that didn't spoil in a saddlebag, didn't require cooking, and provided concentrated nutrition that fresh meat couldn't match. A pound of dried meat represented 4 or 5 pounds of fresh, making it ideal for military military campaigns, long-distance trade, and winter storage when every cubic foot of storage space mattered. Some dried meats, like Italian bresaola or Swiss Bunderfleisch, were considered delicacies, expensive products that took weeks to produce but commanded premium prices. Fruit drying transformed seasonal abundance into year-round availability. Apples, pears, plums, cherries all became wrinkled, intensely sweet dried versions that lasted through winter and could be reconstituted in water for cooking. Some medieval households created fruit leathers by pounding dried fruit into sheets, a technique that concentrated sugars even further and created portable snacks that wouldn't ferment or mold. These weren't primitive approximations of modern dried fruit. These were often superior products with more intense flavors and better keeping qualities than most of what is available in stores today. Honey doesn't spoil. Not doesn't spoil easily. Actually doesn't spoil. Archaeologists have found 3,000-year-old honey in Egyptian tombs that's still edible. This is not because honey is somehow sterile. It is because honey is biochemically hostile to microbial life in ways that make it one of nature's perfect preservatives. Medieval Europeans understood honey's preservative power and used it ruthlessly. Fruits submerged in honey lasted years. Meat cooked and sealed in honey remained edible for months. Nuts, herbs, and even flowers were preserved in honey, creating pantry items that were simultaneously food storage and medicine. Honey's high sugar content creates an osmotic environment that dehydrates bacteria, the same principle as salt preservation, but with a sweet result instead of a salty one. But honey preservation had an economic barrier that limited its use. Honey was expensive. A household might have access to 20 pounds of salt for the cost of 1 pound of honey. This made honey preservation a luxury technique used for valuable foods or medicinal preparations rather than bulk storage. The foods preserved in honey were often gifts, trade goods, or items set aside for special occasions, not the daily staples that kept a family fed. The exception was in regions with abundant wild honey or established beekeeping traditions. Eastern European households with access to forest hives used honey preservation more extensively, creating regional specialties where honey was the primary preservative rather than an expensive alternative. Honey-preserved nuts, honey-preserved ginger, honey-preserved citrus peel. These items filled medieval spice cabinets and provided flavors that could not be achieved through any other preservation method. Honey also acted as a preservative enhancer when combined with other techniques. Honey-glazed smoked ham lasted longer than either honey-preserved or smoke-preserved ham alone. Honey mixed with salt created brines that were both preservative and flavoring agents. This combining of methods, what modern food scientists call hurdle technology, was medieval preservation at its most sophisticated, using multiple barriers to microbial growth rather than relying on a single technique. Medieval food preservation wasn't primitive. It was sophisticated, diverse, and adapted to local conditions in ways that modern industrial preservation often isn't. These techniques didn't emerge from scientific understanding of microbiology that came centuries later. They emerged from observation, experimentation, and the unforgiving reality that preservation failures meant starvation. The loss of these methods represents more than lost knowledge. It represents lost resilience. A medieval household with a stocked root cellar, smoked meats hanging in the attic, fermented vegetables in barrels, and salt-preserved fish in casks could survive supply chain disruptions, economic collapse, or natural disasters that would cripple modern families dependent on weekly grocery runs and constant refrigeration. They weren't preppers obsessing over unlikely scenarios. They were ordinary people living with technologies that made self-sufficiency possible. Most of these techniques still work exactly as they did 700 years ago. Salt hasn't changed. The bacteria that cause food spoilage haven't developed resistance to smoke or fermentation or desiccation. What's changed is our knowledge, our willingness to invest time in preservation, and our comfort with foods that don't come from climate-controlled industrial facilities. Medieval preservation required more labor than opening a refrigerator, but it required no electrical grid, no supply chain, no ongoing costs beyond initial setup. That's not a return to primitive conditions. That's independence.